All right, what's up, everyone? We're live today. I'm with John, the Godless Engineer, joining us today. So thank you so much for coming on today, John.
Oh yeah, no problem. I really enjoy having discussions, just really almost about anything. So I jumped at the chance to come on here and talk about stuff.
Yeah, 100%. So I don't know. Just want to make sure for everyone listening, like I don't know what you guys were expecting with this. This isn't going to be like some like formal debate. We're going to be at it for like an hour or so. I just kind of have some questions from John and maybe some follow-ups, and we'll just kind of take it from there. The whole idea why I wanted to do this is just to learn from John, just try to see what he believes and why he believes it. And yeah, so I guess to start off, maybe if you could just in maybe like a minute or two, maybe three, just talk about how you. It's a big question about how you got to where you are today.
Right. So it's not that exciting of a story. I grew up Catholic, and so I went to Catholic private school and Catholic church until I was about in fifth grade, which would make me like 10 or 11 or so. And then after that point, we started going to more Protestant type churches, Southern Baptist, Lutheran, other denominations like that. And I spent the rest of my time as a Christian in there. And then I guess later on, like after high school, maybe I was more non-denominational. I didn't really go to church all that much, but I did have friends that were going to Southern Baptist churches. And so I would go with them on occasion, or I would go to non-denominational churches. And then one time my friend, right after a church softball game, he kind of questioned my faith in God, and was trying to help me in the direction of I guess fundamentalist Christianity. And he told me that you're not a real Christian unless you read the Bible, or take the Bible literally from cover to cover. So he believed in the 6-day creation, 6,000 years, all that good creationist stuff. And I knew that I couldn't believe that. So I thought that well, I guess I'm not a real Christian. I got to figure out what I believed in. So I took some time and I critically examined what I believed, and it led me down a path where I eventually came to the conclusion that I didn't believe in a God. I just couldn't see the evidence for it. I wasn't convinced by any of the evidence that I found that one does exist for sure. So I had to come to a sensible conclusion of agnostic atheism. That's where I don't know whether or not a God exists, but I don't believe one to exist. And, I've refined what I believe over time with more reflection on the different arguments and more reflection on what I actually believe. But it took probably about six to 9 months or so for me to lose my faith in God altogether.
So when was this that you lost your faith? Like, were you in college? Was it after college? Time frame?
Well, it was. Let's see. It was definitely while I was in college. Because I know I hadn't graduated with my master's yet. I was about 25, so that was about 10 years ago or so. So, see, that would put me. I graduated with my bachelor's in computer engineering in 2009, and so somewhere around 2009, 2010, I came to the conclusion that I didn't believe in God anymore. So, yeah, it was right around that time.
Okay. So what inspired you to start your YouTube channel, and kind of like what's the goal of what you're doing, everything with YouTube wise?
Well, so I started out on Facebook. I had this new worldview that didn't agree with pretty much anybody in my family, and so I decided that I was going to make a page on Facebook so that I could put all of my memes, or I could interact with Facebook as this sort of anonymous page, and I chose Godless Engineer because it kind of described me. I was newly godless, right, and I was also freshly an engineer. So I started posting. I started making my own memes, my own images, to spread various ideas that I had. And it got to the point where the page was getting really popular, and I decided that I wanted to take, my activism to another level and do videos. And so I just sort of randomly made videos there for a while, and I didn't really take it seriously until a few years ago when I decided that I was going to start posting on regular schedule, start posting multiple times a week. And I had, a lot of ideas that I wanted to go through, and I still have like a ton of things that I want to go through on my channel. But yeah, I would say the main draw for me starting a YouTube channel and starting to make videos is that I wanted to join that particular part of the community. I wanted to be this active voice, for my position. And so I just went full in with that.
Okay. So I just want to go back now a little bit, kind of just work our way forward, kind of like from when you were a Christian to like now when you're an atheist. So we'll just start with when you're a Christian a little bit. So you said you went to Catholic school for a while. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, side question here. I played sports with a Catholic school, and I noticed like on the doors and stuff, they'd always have the lettering at the top of the doors. Did you have anything like that? It's not really related. I'm just curious with when you went to Catholic school.
I mean, I don't remember letters above the doors. What kind of letters are you talking about?
I don't even know. It'd just be like A plus B plus C, but not literally A, B, C, just various letters. And then usually like the year on and I still really don't know what that was. So I was just curious if you knew.
No, I mean, I only went up to 5th grade, and we really didn't have sports. It was pretty simple. Mm-hmm. So that might be something they do like in high school or something.
Okay. Anyways, so how long would you say you were a Catholic for?
Let's see. We left the Catholic Church. I want to say when I was about maybe 10 or 11 years old. So I'd probably say solidly for the first 9 years, I was considered Catholic.
Okay. And then you transitioned to like a more like a Protestant type faith almost.
Well, yeah. So we left the Catholic Church and we just started going to, I can't remember. I think it was like a Baptist church. We really didn't go to church all that much after that point. But I know my mom ended up at a Lutheran church, and I had bounced around different Southern Baptist, non-denominational, and just regular Baptist churches.
Okay. So next question I want to ask you is about like, do you think like at that time, did you believe you had a relationship with God? And like the point of this isn't to be like, hey, see this guy, he didn't actually have a relationship with God. He's not a real Christian. That's not what I'm trying to angle at here. I'm just trying to wonder, what did you believe that you had some sort of relationship with a creator, God?
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely felt that way. I remember as a kid thinking about how, in the Bible, there's Adam and Eve, and if Adam and Eve were the first two people, then we're all related, right? We're all we're all related, and so I mean, I do remember that. And when I was in high school, I regularly, prayed to God and asked for forgiveness and stuff like that. I mean, granted, my attachment to my faith when I was, not just in high school, but throughout, my time being religious, I really wasn't all that attached to my faith. I had certain points in time in my life where I felt like I needed to be more attached to it, and I tried to be more attached, but I could never get to that place that I guess most Christians find themselves in. Mm-hmm. And so that was always a struggle with me is, when I was a Christian was, am I doing the right things as a Christian person? Like, and maybe I should pray more, and everything like that. But I definitely felt like I had a personal relationship with whatever God I considered that I had.
Okay. How did you think you had that relationship with the God you believed in at that point? If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Okay, I'm just saying like some Christians often believe that God speaks to them in certain ways. So kind of like, did you believe that in your relationship God spoke to you? I guess I could have made that question more clearly. Things like that.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, I had asked a teacher at my Catholic school about, praying for real things in this world, like praying to get a bike or praying to get something physical and tangible. And it was explained to me at that time as like, you don't really, that's not what you use prayer for. You pray for God to give you strength and all this other stuff. And so that's what I kind of focused on was, I focused on the things in my life that I thought I could interpret as God, like talking to me, God, in those kind of ways, not literally like a voice in my head or anything like that. But I felt like anytime I had a random memory popped up that was embarrassing, that was like God punishing me for something, I felt that whenever just about anything would happen, and my first thought was, oh, that's God trying to tell me something, like those kinds of things. So I definitely felt like God, I guess, spoke, quote unquote, spoke to me in my daily life. But of course, I don't know. It came and went, just like with my adherence to my faith, or my connection to my faith. It kind of it was weak at times, and it was stronger at times. So it really correlated, with those weak and strong times.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about what started to lead you to like an atheistic view, but do you think you could elaborate maybe a little bit more on some of those doubts that you had that kind of, or kind of like the journey that led you to becoming an atheist?
Well, the journey to me becoming an atheist really kind of, it was no, like, there was no one argument that really stumped me or caused me to stumble or anything like that. It was really just the proposition that I wasn't actually a Christian, and the idea that, well, if I'm not a Christian, then what do I believe? Because up until that point, I had been told what to believe my entire life.
Mhm.
Like, I'd been told, well, God exists, Jesus is his son, and we pray to Jesus and we pray to God, and we do all of these ritualistic things, and these were all like normalized to me. So at the point of me considering, well, maybe I'm not actually a Christian, that right there, I guess, was my biggest stumbling, as far as in the faith, was the idea that I could not believe in God, or not necessarily in God, but not knowing what I believed. And so when I started looking at the evidence, at that point in my life, like I was either had graduated college, or was about to graduate college. And so when I took a look, at the evidence, I had a very analytical way to go about it. I was looking for direct evidence that, like, a God existed, or anything in the Bible matched reality. And so when I looked at the evidence and I looked at the arguments for God's existence, I just came away unconvinced of the actual arguments that God existed. And as soon as I removed that roadblock of, well, this is what I'm told to believe, so this is what I believe, and I started critically examining what I believed, that was the domino.
Okay. Talk about the whole God stuff in a minute, but before we get into that, just one more question. So we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but what does it look like? Obviously, like never been to the Deep South because Alabama is considered part of the Deep South. I don't really know what it's like there, but what's it like for you being an atheist in Alabama?
Well, I mean, it's really not too bad. There are certain issues that pop up every now and then. One of the big concerns is, of course, the school systems here. I've got a son who's 10 years old, and he goes to a school. He goes to a public school, and me and my co-parenting person, his mother, we don't try to influence him, as well as both me and my wife, Casey. We don't try to influence him at all as far as religion goes, because we feel that he's way too young to really be concerned about that. And so one of the biggest concerns is, one, the public school system, and then two, like kids in his class talking about religion and what he's going to say about religion and stuff like that. And I've had to get in touch with the FFRF one time in the past, because the public school had all the kids pray before lunch one time, and I really wasn't okay with that. I would hope that most parents wouldn't want their kid to be told to say some kind of prayer that might be against, however they teach their kids how to pray. I feel like it should be a very personal thing, the relationship between, a child and their faith, if they have faith. And I don't really agree that anybody other than the parents should be able to dictate that, So that's one concern. Everything else, like at work, I don't really have too much of a problem. I have been in some work environments where people will talk a lot, and congregate a lot. And so whenever I would join in, the conversation would go south a few times, not because of me exactly, but because the other people in the group would get angry because, I wouldn't just, toe the line with things that they said. And so, I mean, it's not too difficult, but at the same time, there are concerns that I have.
Okay. If you were to just give a percentage, what percentage of the people do you think in your area are Christians?
Oh, I don't know, 90%, I would say.
Wow.
If not more than that. I mean, it's North Alabama. If you're not Christian, then it's kind of odd.
Mm-hmm. What about atheists? For that other 10%, would that be more atheists, or are they other religious beliefs, or anything else?
I mean, there's always going to be a mixture. I don't really have good numbers on it, but I would probably say that there's a good mixture of Jewish individuals as well as Islamic or Hindu people.
Okay. So I'd love to just pick your brain almost with God and kind of your beliefs about, or more of your lack of beliefs about God. So obviously you're an atheist. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I'm sure you'd agree that it's important that we dialogue with people that we don't agree with. So I think you talked about it a little bit, but can you just talk about, as of now, what does it mean for you to be an atheist?
Well, for me, I mean, it's just not believing in a deity, whether that be multiple deities or a single deity, just simply, not believing in them. And then, of course, I take the position of agnostic atheist. So that's, I don't know whether or not a God exists, but I don't believe one to exist. And so that those two, I feel like that entire label really kind of sums up my position completely, because I feel like it's untenable to be Gnostic about either side of it. I really don't think that you'd be able to prove that one doesn't exist, but I also don't think you can prove that one definitely does exist. So I think at most you could really just be agnostic about the question. But I do realize that there's plenty of Christians out there that definitely know that a God exists, and that's fine. But I still feel like it's a really, really hard position to be in.
Okay. So what would is there anything that would convince you that a God exists?
That's a really good question, and I'm not exactly sure what exactly would prove that a God exists. A good start, though, would being able to prove that the supernatural events happen. I think that would be a good first step. That doesn't necessarily point to like a God existing, but like I said, it gets you one step closer, I think, to a God existing. Because right now, any supernatural event that you can probably name that's happened in the past actually occurred naturally with natural reasons as to why it occurred. And so until you can prove that something can, I guess, randomly disrupt the natural course of reality, the natural order of reality, um, uh, I guess it would have to be somewhat random. Um, then unless you can prove that, then I think that if you could prove that, that would get me closer to thinking that a deity exists. But beyond proving supernatural events happen, I'm not really sure what kind of evidence we would be able to obtain that shows that God exists. But I would say supernatural would be a good start.
Okay. So what would kind of convince you that something occurred in terms of miraculous? Like, for example, obviously there's a lot of people who are Christians or theists who would believe that these events are occurring. Like, for example, my boss, who I work with in the summer, would claim that he laid hands on someone who was blind, and then or not, maybe not him, but he was with a missions group that laid hands on someone who was blind, and then he saw. Or I saw that, I think it was Lee Strobel retweeted this like medical journal where he basically claimed it was evidence of a miracle because there's no possible explanation from a naturalistic framework. So as an atheist, how do you kind of look at those miracle claims that you see from theists?
Well, as far as you said that you know somebody that laid hands on someone, on a blind person, while they were on a mission trip, and then they were able to see.
He was with the group that did, yeah. That's what he was saying. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm immediately very skeptical about that because of the fact that that's just simply not how things work in reality. I think in order to prove something like that was actually a miracle, you would need to set up, a lot of things and record a lot of things in order to show that a miracle actually took place. You would have to verify in some way that the person actually was blind. How do you know that that person wasn't just planted there by the guy that was doing the miracle? How do you know that he wasn't just sort of legally blind and then could, when they did something, he pretended that he could see, or he set it up in some way to make it seem like the guy could see again or something like that. There's a million different ways in which that could have happened, naturally. And I couldn't exactly hear what your second example of a miracle was.
Yeah, it's just something more of we've seen. I just saw Lee Strobel put out a tweet a few days ago, just with like a recent medical journal, which talked about. I didn't read it. I just kind of saw the article and was like, okay, interesting. Just kept scrolling. But it was just like a medical journal where apparently some event occurred that there is no natural explanation, and basically the doctors are like, we have no idea how this occurred. Some sort of like healing. I'm not honestly super familiar with it. I'm just kind of more asking for like, what do you think when like these medical journals will come out with something that says, hey, there's no explanation in medicine for why this tumor disappeared or this bone came back together. I don't know, things like that.
Well, I would say that for one, there's a lot of things we don't know about our body, and we're still figuring out, different things today. And so just because we don't know the explanation for it doesn't mean that it happened miraculously. I would say that you would need a lot more evidence in order to suggest that it actually happened supernaturally than just, oh, we don't have answers. I think that there's a lot of things that people don't know. We're also restricted by our own experiences and our own ability to understand this reality. So I think that, the most likely case is that there's some natural process, whether or not we know about it now, that happened that caused the person to get better or something to happen. The most likely case is that, because we don't have any recorded medical miracles or anything like that to happen as of yet. We have things that we don't understand or that we don't know, but it's a giant leap to go from, oh, we don't know how this happened, to, well, God must have done it. Because then the question becomes, well, which God did it? Was it Zeus? Was it any of the number of pagan deities? Is it Allah? Could Allah be responsible for it? It's kind of hard to jump to a specific God definition, let alone just a general God description.
Okay, yeah, totally get what you're saying there. So what would you? Sorry, I'm just trying to think about how to frame this question here. Sorry, I just totally blanked there. I had a thought. Okay, I got it now. It's all back together. So let's just say theoretically, there's this event that occurs. There's no explanation naturally, and this event convinces you that there's a supernatural force. If there is an event that would convince you, what kind of event? Well, basically, what I'm asking is, what could convince you, in terms of like an argument for miracles, that a supernatural event has occurred?
Well, I mean, you would have to figure out some way to show a total suspension of the natural order of reality. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but I would say that if you could sufficiently prove beyond reasonable doubt that it was an actual suspension of the natural order of reality, then you would have a good case for like a supernatural event. But the problem is, though, with supernatural events is that as soon as you can explain it like in reality, because it happened in reality, it automatically becomes a natural event. That's not to say that natural events can't be like caused by God in some way. I would think that you would need to show that causal link between a deity and the natural events, which right now our understanding is that we don't need any supernatural intervention for natural events to occur. So I would say that if you could sufficiently prove that it was a natural suspension of if it was a suspension of the natural order of reality, you would have a good case for a supernatural event.
Okay. Just kind of one more question on this before we keep going here. Let's just say, like, theoretically, let's just say you lose your ear, right? It just gets like chopped off, right? So that's gone. And then let's just say theoretically someone comes and doesn't, for this question, it doesn't really matter if it's a Christian or Muslim or Jew, someone who believes in a theistic God prays for you, that the ear grows back, and that ear eventually does grow back. And the doctors would say, hey, there's no explanation naturally for why your ear grow back. It must have been, well, we don't know. Would that convince you that there's some sort of like supernatural element to reality?
I'm not exactly sure. Just because, I mean, I would say that as soon as you could rule out other possibilities, that, maybe, I don't know, you had like one of those first aid sprays from Resident Evil or something like that, and you sprayed it on your ear and your ear grew back or something like that. Like, I don't know, I would say that you would have a good case for it if you ruled out every other explanation. But that's why proving supernatural events is really tough, is because you have to be able to rule out all these other explanations. Because, like, if you think about it, a long time ago, we used to think that lightning came from the gods. Like, the gods caused rain, the gods caused lightning. I mean, the gods even controlled seasonal patterns. And now we understand those particular natural events. We know how they happen. We know how seasons work. We know how lightning and thunder works. We know how eclipses work. So I would say that you would need to be able to rule out like all natural explanations in order to suggest that it was a supernatural one.
Okay. Appreciate your thoughts there. Just like learning from you. I want to ask you some more, a little bit about God and stuff. Maybe just transition maybe a little bit to some of more of the other arguments for the existence of God. I know for you, you believe morality is subjective, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about I saw you made a TikTok. Actually, I mean, I don't agree with you, but I really like the TikTok that you made about moral subjectivism. I think it was a few months ago, actually. But what for you? Why are you a moral subjectivist?
Well, I'm a moral subjectivist because I see differences in moral foundations, and the best explanation for those differences is the fact that morality is subjective to each of us. And a lot of people see the commonalities between everybody's moral foundation because we all live in the same society. But when you take a look at, when you compare yourself to other societies that exist out there, you see vast differences of moral foundations and moral behaviors. And the best explanation that I can get to for that is that it's a natural consequence of a complex central nervous system. It's just an emergent property of our complex brains. And the reason why the God explanation doesn't really cut it for me is because if you take a look at the Christian moral foundation, if you will, it changes even in today's landscape. The Christian morality, the basic Christian moral foundation, I would say, changes depending on what area of the country you live in, what society that you live in, and then if you look back in time, you have different moral foundations for Christians across the ages. You have morality changing through time, and so it really doesn't seem like Christianity, or at least the Christian God, isn't the source of morality. And morality, even in Christianity, seems to be malleable. And with how malleable it is, and the fact that it changes with a shift in societal norms, it seems more like we are the ones that control this moral foundation, and the societies that we live in control these moral foundations that we have. And so that is way more likely than a supernatural God explanation, because it is a natural explanation for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think I totally get what you're saying here. So think about this. I want to go back to that in a second, but one thing I want to ask you, obviously, any sort of like theist who believes in an objective moral standard would probably the first question they'd ask you is, if morality is subjective, let's say, for example, the Holocaust, was that wrong? I'm sure the question, anytime you say you're a moral subjectivist, that's the first question you get. But what kind of response would you give to that question?
Well, I mean, it's just the same as me comparing my moral foundation to any other society's moral foundation. Whenever we talk about them being absolutely wrong or anything like that, what we're really talking about is our shared moral foundation that we have, and we're comparing that shared moral foundation to this other group's moral foundation. And so we have a certain number of moral facts that we have deemed are absolutely true, right? Even though they're not really absolutely true, at least I don't feel like they are. They're very nuanced in just about every situation. But it's really just comparing your own moral foundation to their moral foundation. And I mean, you do that all the time with other people. I mean, if you just look at social media, you'll find people that, use their own moral judgment to condemn or praise other people on the internet, and even in your own lives, because you as a Christian could feel one way about a topic and think that is the morally correct way to respond to a certain situation, while another Christian out there could feel completely different about it, and they could have a different sense of morality. And just because there do exist these commonalities between our moral foundations in our society, even across societies, there are commonalities between moral foundations. That doesn't ultimately mean that a God was there to give it. I think that it's more about what allows a society to survive, and those particular commonalities have been worked into the societies that we have now. That's why, like, me as an American, and then like somebody from Great Britain and somebody from France can all look at the Third Reich and be like, that was pretty whack. Like, that was abhorrent, kind of thing. And we can do this with multiple things, but I think that the way that I would respond is just that it is subjective, but I'm using my own moral foundation and the common foundation that we all have in order to condemn that particular society.
Okay, yeah. I think I totally get what you're saying here. And I think in a lot of ways, from your perspective, I totally get, like, it makes sense to me. I think that for the Christian or for the theist, someone like me, I think they would say that moral foundation that you're talking about doesn't really come from ourselves. It comes from God. But I think I really understand what you're saying there. So, yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I was just going to say that harkens back to like the different moral foundations that Christians have. I mean, there was a couple out in California just maybe like a year ago or so that, chained up their 12 children in the basement and barely fed them anything, and abused them their entire lives, but they did it because they felt like God was telling them to do it. And while a lot of Christians now would see that as a perversion of their faith and that they were completely wrong in it, it still doesn't change the fact that they felt like God was calling on them to do this. And if you look across time in Christianity, you see the Christian ideal of how God wants you to morally act changing. Because at one point in time, it was perfectly fine to like have slaves. And then after 1865, when we started really cracking down on the slave trade and eventually, completely abolishing it and even giving African Americans the equal rights and all that, like we see this moral foundation of Christianity, this what seems to be a core tenet of it, changing in real time as society changes first, and then Christianity catches up to it. So, I mean, it's a really big blow to Christianity that you don't have God issuing a moral foundation or a set of rules at one time, and then Christians always obey those rules. Like as soon as Jesus ascended back up into heaven, that's when the changes started, according to the faith. I don't think that he ascended back into heaven, but at that point in time, people started to twist the faith. They would twist it in their own direction. And we even have evidence of that in the history of the New Testament in general.
I would agree with you that a lot of times Christians will try to bend their beliefs to try to fit what they want to do. For example, with the whole slavery thing, I would agree with you on that. So, like, obviously, I'm not looking to debate you, or I would obviously...
Oh, I know.
Stuff. So I'm just trying to understand. I don't want it to sound like I'm just like, okay, and just trying to like skip everything you're saying. So, okay. You good to move on here? I just want to talk about some other stuff for a little bit.
Okay.
Sweet. I appreciate your time. So just maybe talk about one more kind of like argument for the existence of God. Because obviously I've seen a lot of stuff online about the cosmological argument. So, I mean, just go with maybe like a simple Kalam, maybe. But like, what's your thought on the general idea of the cosmological argument?
And let's see, the cosmological argument, that would be the first cause argument, right?
Correct.
So I don't dispute that there was something that caused the inflation of the universe. I just I don't see a connection to a deity that needs to be there in order for it to start. I think that it could have very well happened naturally. The laws of physics seem to break down the closer you get to the singularity, just before the inflation of the universe. But I don't think that necessarily means that things still couldn't happen naturally. I feel like the inflation of the universe is definitely a natural event, even though we don't know what actually caused it. So I guess on the surface, I agree with portions of the Kalam argument, but it's when the cosmological argument posits that God had to exist in order for the universe to come into existence. That is where it kind of breaks down for me. I don't see that causal connection.
Okay. Do you believe that there was some sort of like ex nihilo beginning to the universe?
You're talking about like coming from nothing?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think that it was necessarily nothing. I don't know what the state of the universe was like prior to that. We do know that the universe inflated to a size a little smaller than what it is now, like on a cosmic scale smaller. But it inflated in less than 10 to the negative 32 seconds is how fast it inflated. And then regular expansion happened after that. So it's not necessarily that it came from nothing. It's more like it inflated and created space time and everything like that, and in an incredibly short amount of time. But I still don't think that it started with nothing exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks for your answers. I appreciate it. Just maybe for like the last 20 minutes or so here, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your beliefs regarding Christianity specifically, because I mean, obviously I'm a Christian. That's what I believe. So I guess just start off, maybe just kind of give like your general beliefs regarding Christianity, kind of maybe like talk a little bit about like where you believe it came from or like things like that.
Okay. Well, as far as Christianity goes, I believe Christianity is definitely based off of the Old Testament. It was written, the New Testament was written to fulfill certain things from the Old Testament. I believe that Paul started having visions of Jesus in about the 50. Well, he started writing in the 50s, but I think like sometime before that, just maybe a few years into the 30s, he started having visions, about Jesus, and other people were having visions about Jesus, and so they initially wrote letters and everything like that, and then later on the gospel started being written, first with Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. But ultimately I feel like the Christian faith really just relies on the visions and understanding of the scriptures as coming from the original apostles, which would have included Paul and Peter. So I don't really see a lot of evidence that Christianity is true in the sense that, Jesus came, he died for our sins, and he resurrected and then ascended back into heaven. I don't believe any of that because there just is a lack of evidence to suggest that that is what actually happened.
Okay. So great point to start in here. I know you actually responded to me at some point. I actually haven't still finished that video. I'm sorry. I apologize. I need to get.
No, that's fine. I don't expect everybody to watch all my videos or anything like that. I put out a lot of content. So, I put it out there for people to find and watch whenever they can.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. I promise you. It's just life is insane right now. But regarding, obviously, I know one of the things I talked about was Jesus mythicism, and I'm still not completely sure your position on Jesus myth. I don't know if you're a Jesus mythicist or if you just say that it's a valid belief. Where are you on the whole Jesus mythicism ideas?
Well, I think the most likely explanation, like for the origins of Christianity, is that Jesus started out as a myth. I still think that there's a possibility that Jesus could have existed, but I don't really think that if he did, we have any evidence that would suggest that he did. Currently, I feel like the evidence points in the direction of mythical at first. But I am open to there being some kind of new evidence or new argument that could prove that he most likely existed. But currently, right now, I technically I say that I think he probably didn't exist.
Okay. So what about like other ancient historical figures? Take for example, let's say Alexander the Great. Would you evaluate the existence of the Alexander the Great with the same standards as you would, for example, the existence of Jesus? And if so, where are you on the existence of, let's just say, I don't know if you know too much about Alexander the Great, but someone like him?
Oh yes, I know plenty about Alexander the Great.
Great.
Well, I mean, this is one of the historical figures that regularly gets brought up because we don't have a written record about Alexander the Great until Arian about 500 years later. And a lot of times that's brought up because we have like the Gospels that are written just 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. But the big difference between the Gospels and Arian's record of Alexander the Great is that Arian used and named firsthand sources that discussed Alexander the Great. Most importantly, two of Alexander's generals. And he had access to these government records from these generals. And so he told his history of Alexander the Great from firsthand accounts. He directly names who he got his information from, and he follows what we would consider good historiography for the time. How that compares to the Gospels is that the Gospels don't name their authors, they don't name their sources. And in fact, the only sources that they really do cite in the Gospels is the scriptures, or are the scriptures, which would be the Septuagint at the time. And so that's how the evidence differs for the two. So we have firsthand accounts about, Arian used firsthand accounts about Alexander the Great in order to tell his history, while the Gospels did not, at least do not suggest or name any kind of eyewitness accounts that would tie, Jesus to an earthly existence.
Okay. So what do you think of, let's just think, I'm just thinking here, let's just take like maybe like 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 15, who someone like a Habermas or Lacona would say is the earliest Christian creed. I've heard they date it to like a couple years after the alleged resurrection, so like 35-ish AD, where it talks about Paul claiming that Jesus appeared to Peter and the 12. I'm totally messing it up, but that's like the general idea. So how would you view that claim?
Well, I mean, I don't dispute that it probably existed around the time that most scholars say it existed, but really the only thing that it can really get back to is a belief that these things happened. The things that Paul says are rhetoric. I mean, he talks about how Jesus appeared to 500 people. Who were these people? Where was this appearance at? We don't have any kind of information that we could use in order to validate it. Even at the time, if he said, 500 people from so-and-so city, Jesus appeared to them. I mean, who would be able to come up and be like, I didn't see that? Like, there's literally no way in order to verify that those things happen. So what it really gets back to is just the belief that Jesus appeared to people. And I do believe that Paul believed that, as well as he believed in these visions that he had of Jesus. But the problem is that Paul would be a contemporary of Jesus. So he would have firsthand knowledge of disciples or even Jesus's ministry. But what we find is that Paul doesn't mention any of these things. He doesn't mention an earthly ministry. He doesn't mention any disciples, which I know that he talks about Peter, but Peter isn't, he's not indicated by Paul to be a disciple. He's indicated to be an apostle, sure, but not a disciple. So evidence like the Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say definitely dates early, but it can only get you back to a belief that these things happened and not an actual account of these things happening.
So for you, what would be like an actual account of these things happening? What would make you believe that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 would be an actual account of things happening? What would convince you of that?
Well, I mean, I would say that he would need, like actual sources cited. So like consider the Alexander the Great thing. How Arian has his history set up is that he used firsthand accounts. He names those firsthand accounts, and he has a reason for having access to those firsthand accounts. But what we find in the Bible, especially in Paul's letters, is that he doesn't name any sources, or the only things that he really cites are visions and scriptures. So any of the information that he has about Jesus is going to come from these visions and the scriptures. So as far as the Pauline Creed goes, it talks about Jesus, being crucified, dying, and resurrecting. Those are all things that would have been told to him by Jesus, by Jesus through visions or in the scriptures. And then the people seeing him, let's take the 500 at face value and say that there were 500 people that saw a risen Jesus. Well, that would still just be a, belief in a vision, or at least a belief that they saw the resurrected Jesus. That he doesn't give us any names. He doesn't give us a date. He doesn't give us any kind of information that we can use to validate it. Whereas in comparison to Arian and Alexander the Great, we have the names of the generals. We have that they are actual generals of Alexander the Great. So the differences in the evidence is pretty vast.
Okay. So I'm just trying to just put together everything you believe here. So I think you said it was Arian who put together the first account of Alexander the Great. Is that correct? Or am I?
Well, not the first one.
The first recorded one. Yeah.
Well, no, it's the best account of Alexander's life. So it's the best history that we have access to.
Okay. So that would be a secondary source, and I think a lot of Christians would say that let's say 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, or maybe the other claimed beliefs of the appearance of like the women seeing the appearances or things like that, those would be primary sources because they'd be taken from the actual eyewitness, or they claim to be taken from the eyewitnesses. Do you follow what I'm saying?
It doesn't claim to be taken from the eyewitnesses.
It doesn't? Okay.
There's no eyewitness claims in any of Paul's writings. Paul's reciting a creed that he received, sure, and that creed is early, but it's still like this is far removed from a secondary source, because basically Paul is repeating things that he's heard from other people that have been told this. So at best you could say that it's third-hand information. It's not second-hand information. And Arian, while he is a secondary source, he's using primary sources in order to inform us. So really we have access to primary sources through this secondary source that's Arian, and we just don't have that with Paul. At best that we could say is that we have third-hand sources in the form of the Pauline Creed.
Okay. Thank you for that. So last point here on Jesus mythicism, things like that. Last question. Well, not point, last question. Why do you think the most scholars would reject Jesus mythicism, even usually on a more liberal side? For example, like Bart Ehrman, usually one of the leading. I don't even know if he's an atheist anymore. He really does some interesting stuff, but he's obviously not a Christian. So why do you think most scholars tend to reject Jesus mythicism?
Well, when you say most scholars, I would bet that the scholars that are looking into this particular question or would have relevant degrees in this question, or for this question, I know for a fact that they are mostly Christian. I mean, you don't really have a lot of people from outside the Christian faith that are focusing on this. I mean, there's not really the job market for it. There's not, there's just not a lot of there's not a lot of interest outside of Christianity to study this. So most of your scholars are going to be Christian, and so they're going to be using the exact same type of arguments that they use to prove the resurrection that they do to prove that Jesus existed. And I feel like the evidence for the resurrection is pretty poor. The arguments for the resurrection is pretty poor, and I feel the same way about the evidence for the existence of Jesus. Now, you did mention, more critical scholars like Bart Ehrman, but even Bart Ehrman is seriously flawed on this particular question. You can look at multiple reviews of his book, not like Amazon reviews, but like, for instance, Raphael Lataster recently put out a book where he examined Bart Ehrman's work before, during, and after the Did Jesus Exist book. And the quality of history that he does on either side of that particular book is vastly different than the work and quality that he put into the Did Jesus Exist book. So it's pretty obvious that while Bart Ehrman isn't biased exactly, I do think that his methodology is flawed, and I get that because I've actually heard his arguments. I mean, he thinks that like the Gospels are independent accounts of Jesus's life, and different things like that. And I just really haven't found his arguments for the historical Jesus to be compelling.
Okay. Last question I have for you here. Before that's like, and then I'm out of questions, obviously. But what would convince you, if there is anything that would convince you that, let's say, for example, the resurrection of Jesus happened?
So let's see, what would convince me that the resurrection of Jesus would happen, or did happen? I mean, it's a supernatural event. So you would have to find some way, which it being in history is a lot harder, because a lot of people want to think that things are like either 100% definite or 0% couldn't have happened. But that's not really how history is done. History is done based on probabilities. And so you have to figure out what is the most probable thing to happen. And when you go into history, the farther back you go, the harder it is to say anything with any great amount of certainty. Even like with Arian and his primary sources, that's not 100% certain. There's some level of skepticism that does exist there. I'm not exactly sure what that would be, because I haven't looked that far into the evidence for Alexander the Great. But for Jesus, I think that it would be monumentally hard to prove a supernatural event in the past. And I know that people like Mike Licona and Gary Habermas think that you can definitely use history to prove that miracles happened. But I feel like all of those arguments that do that are contrived, and they have to make these impossible logical assertions and ad hoc assumptions in order to make their hypothesis work. Like recently, I looked at Gary Habermas and Mike Licona saying that history can definitely show us that miracles happened. But what they have to do is they have to presuppose that the Christian God existed and that he would have raised Jesus from the dead. And when you have to start presupposing things or ad hoc, tacking on these assumptions that don't have any real evidentiary support, that's when your theory becomes less and less convincing. And so I think that it would be monumentally hard to prove something supernatural happened in history, just due to the fact that we don't have a lot of evidence to begin with, let alone evidence for supernatural things.
Okay. Appreciate your answer. So that's all the questions I have. Before we wrap things up, do you have anything you want to say, add, anything?
No, I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation with you, man. I appreciate you having me on. I know that in the online space, we can get a bit more emotional in response videos and everything like that. I know I've tried to change the way that I respond to certain people and things on here. So I hope you don't take any of my video that I did as inflammatory or insulting or anything like that. I do my best not to be insulting unless there's an obvious reason that would. I don't know what a good reason to insult somebody would be, but I try not to do it unless I feel like it's kind of necessary. So I hope you don't take it that way. And I can't wait to see what other videos you have coming out. I mean, I'm subscribed. Everybody that's watching should be subscribed to you so that we can, interact and keep the conversation going. And I just appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I learned a lot. Appreciate you just kind of answering my questions and just let me pick your brain a little bit. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm available anytime that you want to talk about things. You just let me know. Feel free to make any response videos that you want to. I always love seeing people making response videos to me. So yeah, I would be happy to talk to you anytime, man.
Yeah, same to you, man. Anytime. I enjoy this a lot. So yeah, it's the Godless Engineer. I appreciate you coming on, man. I wish you a great night.
All right, you too, dude. Bye.